This evening is to summarize certain significant areas of his teaching, recognizing how impossible it is to do justice to any one of them, much less 4 or 5 of them. I almost need to begin with a mea culpa. And in my own personal experience, it's especially difficult because in my private library, I have over 35 shelves of books on St. Paul. On his letters, on his life, on his theology, on his morality, and so on and so forth. And that's a fraction of the books that have been published. So there is just a whole world out there, much of which, but not most perhaps, have I really mapped out. And so I proceed with a certain degree of fear and trembling. But again, it isn't a live grenade. If we can throw ourselves onto St. Paul. I'd like to divide this evening's presentation into 4 or 5 parts. First, I'd like to focus on the question, was Paul really converted or was he called? Second, I'd like to focus upon the gospel according to St. Paul, or what I would describe as the word of the cross, a phrase taken from 1 Corinthians 1. The word of the cross, which for Paul is practically equivalent to what we would call the gospel. So was Paul called or converted? What does he mean when he speaks about the word of the cross? And then the third element I'd like to focus upon is, what does he mean when he speaks about the church as the body of Christ? Because as we'll see, if you don't already know it, he is the first Christian thinker to introduce the idea that the church is the body of Christ. Something that we all now know. Whether we're Catholics or Protestants, cradlers or converts or reverts or whatever. We all know how to fill in the blank. The church is the body of Christ. St. Paul taught the church. Nobody else in the first century ever once referred to the church as such, but by the 2nd century, everybody did. It had caught on. So what does he mean when he speaks of the church as the body of Christ? The fourth thing I'd like to touch upon is how Paul came to understand the righteousness of God, and how there is a subtle but significant change in his understanding from Saul the Pharisee to Paul the Apostle to the Gentiles. And I wish to conclude by drawing some conclusions, by drawing out the implications for practical Christian living according to St. Paul. All right, first of all, the question is this: was Paul converted or was he simply called? And when you hear it, you're like, well, what a dumb question. Of course he was converted. I mean, he is the paragon of conversion. He is like, Exhibit A. Well, that was always understood up until recently. In the last 40 years, a professor at Harvard, a Lutheran no less, called this into question. Professor Stendhal wrote a famous article entitled Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West, in which he challenged the Protestant stereotype that he himself had perpetrated for years. And what is the stereotype? That just like Luther, Paul found himself in a legalistic religion, tied up with ritualism, and he had a really bad conscience until he encountered Jesus, and then he found the gospel by faith, and it set him free from the law. Because after all, Luther was an Augustinian monk and a priest, tied up in legalism, bound to ritualism. He had a really terror-stricken conscience until he read Romans, and then he found the gospel of Jesus by faith alone, and he was set free from ever having to keep the law. And this correlation has been firmly fixed for over 4 centuries, until Professor Stendhal came along as a Lutheran, and no ordinary Lutheran. He was not only the top-ranking Lutheran biblical scholar at Harvard, he also became a Lutheran archbishop over in Scandinavia. And I read this article when I was a staunch Luther devotee in the mid-70s at college as an undergraduate. And what he did was to sort of state the obvious. He de-Lutheranized Paul by showing us that Paul didn't regard Judaism as some sort of religion that is bound up in legalism and ritualism. Saul did not suffer from a bad conscience the way Luther did. When Paul reflects on his own life as a Pharisee, as he does in Philippians 3, he describes his own spiritual self-image this way. as to the righteousness found in the law, I was blameless, amentos in Greek. He wasn't ridden with guilt. He was very proud of his own moral achievements. So this paradigm of conversion, where he gets knocked off the horse, well, we've already seen that nowhere in the book of Acts we have 3 separate accounts of Paul's own conversion story. And nowhere does he mention a horse. Steve thinks there was a horse. Scott doesn't think there was a horse. Put it this way, we don't know there's a horse until medieval art. Then we see horse in practically every picture of Paul's conversion. In any case, whether he was on a horse or just being pulled by one, whatever, it doesn't matter. But Stendahl raises an important point. Because if you were to interview Paul right after this great experience and say, did you convert from one religion to another? You know, the way Luther abandoned his own medieval Augustinian Catholic priesthood and became the founder of what becomes the Reformation? Or like, you know, Scott Hahn. You know, he abandoned his evangelical Protestant Christianity as a Bible Christian and became this, you know, Roman Catholic papist. Well, I think Paul would say, when I was a Jew, I firmly believed in the promise of God that there would be coming a Messiah who would deliver God's people from their sins and the consequences of those sins. When I was a Pharisee, I drew the conclusion that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. Now that I've met him on the road, and I've heard him speak, and I've seen the light, as a Jew, I firmly believe that the promised Messiah has been fulfilled. He has come. Does that sound like a conversion from one religion to another to you? No. He was a devout Jew who believed that the Messiah would be coming from God. Now, he believed that the Messiah had come. And moreover, he was a student of the great Gamaliel, the greatest rabbi living in Jerusalem, the grandson of Hillel, one of the all-time greats in rabbinic tradition. In fact, Gamaliel, Paul's mentor, is the first of 7 rabbis in Jewish history to ever be referred to as Rabban. Rabbi is my teacher, Rabban is our teacher. He was recognized as the universal teacher of Jews. In fact, there's a saying in the Talmud that describes how when he died, the glory of the Torah ceased, and so did chastity and purity. This man embodied truth as well as purity. And he was the one who mentored Saul the Pharisee. Now, Saul caught something that Gamaliel didn't have, and that was a good case of zeal. And he describes this again in Philippians 3 when he shows us how the zeal that he had for the law is what energized him to be what? A persecutor of the church, and no ordinary persecutor, but the fiercest persecutor of all. In fact, it raises the question. You know, once we've addressed the question, was Paul really converted? Stendahl says, not really. He was called. He was called to Christ and then called to the apostle of Christ to the Gentiles. And I would agree. He wasn't converted if by conversion we mean leaving one religion and entering another. But you know, speaking from my own personal experience for a moment, I don't feel like I was converted either in that sense. Because when I was an evangelical Protestant, I loved Christ, I studied the scriptures, and I was far more in love with Christ than I was opposed to Catholicism. And I was far more devoted to the sacred page than I was to giving books out that distorted the church's teachings in a way that I didn't realize. And so when I became a Catholic way back in '86, I felt that the evangel, the good news, just went to a higher level. There was even more good news than I realized. It wasn't just being saved individually, it was entering into this divine family. And so, you know, I look back and really feel more gratitude for my evangelical formation, my Presbyterian ordination, and all of that. And I think Paul looked back on his own formation as, we'll call him Saul the Pharisee, a student of Gamaliel. He saw all of that as a providential plan of preparation for him to realize the call. By the end of this talk, though, I want to return to this notion and propose to you that it isn't an either-or. Either he was converted or he was called. He wasn't converted if by that we mean changing one religion and embracing another. He was called to Christ and to be the apostle of the Gentiles.